welcome to Now This Interview, the third show with special guest Jon Madof of Rashanim. Klezmer, jazz, Middle Eastern, rock, punk, indie. This is Rashanim. Rashanim is a Jewish power trio from Brooklyn, New York. And Jon Madof, welcome to Now This Interview. He is our special guest, and we are happy to have him here live in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
So you yourself have been compared to greats like Jimi Hendrix, and references have been made to John Cipollina. I don't know if I pronounced his last name right, but he is a legendary jazz guy, to put it simply. And these are really heavy comparisons. And what do you say to the people who make these references to those artists?
I guess I could say I understand that. But, I mean, really, I'm trying to go for my own voice and trying to make Rashanim as strong as possible. So if influences come out, that's great. But, obviously, ultimately, I want the band to sound like us.
Okay, and what is us, in your own words?
It's a good question. It's hard to describe. I mean, the phrase Jewish power trio came to me kind of a few years after the band had started. When I started it, it wasn't a trio, actually. It was a quartet. We had a horn player, played saxophone and clarinet, and the band was very much kind of in the model of groups that came out in the 90s in New York that were influenced by not only klezmer, but Middle Eastern and Eastern European and North African music. And actually the lineup of the band, the instrumentation rather, I kind of based on a band called Pechora from New York.
Okay.
Which was great, and they did a lot of like Turkish kind of stuff, but definitely like the power trio idea was kind of the farthest thing from my mind when we started.
Okay, and that brings me to another question. Through research, I found that you were, your musical influences and interests were of jazz and Buddhism. And what sparked the direction toward this Judaism and klezmer influence?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess, I don't know where you found stuff about Buddhism, but that is true.
Okay. I was about to say, I just made that up. No.
Right, no. That was a good guess. Yeah, I was, like on a personal level into Buddhism for a long time. I've since become observant as a Jew. It kind of all happened at the same time. It was an interesting, like, confluence of events that just kind of happened for me personally. I moved to New York. I got married and kind of started, like, my wife and I together started looking into, our tradition as Jews, and also mostly kind of modern Jewish bands, not the old kind of classic klezmer sound, but that was my introduction to it through people like John Zorn and Andy Statman and the Klezmatics and other ones that were doing not so much Jewish, but like Eastern European, Balkan, Yugoslavian, Bulgarian music. So it all kind of like was happening over a few years around, like, I guess between like 1998 and 2000.
Okay, and speaking of John Zorn, you are on Tzaddik record label, and right. For those of you that aren't familiar with John Zorn, he is a renowned composer and saxophonist. And how did you get that connection, or how did that all come about, being signed to Tzaddik record label?
I met Zorn about 5 years ago. The way that I met him, on like a one-on-one meeting, was kind of very informal. I had made a demo of the group to get gigs, and I had sent it out to a few labels, and I just went and saw Zorn play at a club called Tonic in New York that actually just closed a couple months ago. And I just kind of approached him in between sets and introduced myself and said I'm a guitar player, and I really love and have been influenced by your music, and I'd love for you to check this out. And I gave him the CD, and he was into it.
So right. What do you say to those artists, musicians, that really have the ambition to go out there and become signed? What's your advice to those people?
To me, I mean, there's a lot to be said on this, and it is a really good question, but the music, everything has to come from the music. And that kind of seems like an obvious thing, but I'll just to explain what I mean, like, everything that you do, everyone that you meet, everyone that you associate yourself with, from your band members to tour managers to, publicity, press, everything like that. Everything has to come from the music, and you have to like be completely dedicated to exploring and finding and perfecting your own sound as a musician, no matter what you do. If you're working as like a side musician or a composer, and the biggest thing is like the musicians who we all admire didn't do everything well, and that's kind of hard to admit, but it's really true. Like whoever you can think of, like Hendrix or Coltrane, just to name a few of like my idols as musicians, they weren't great because they could do everything. They were great because they found out who they were as people and as musicians and artists. For me, to put on a Love Supreme, that's Coltrane, and he doesn't need to do everything else. He doesn't need to sound like all the other jazz musicians.
He found his own sound.
Yeah, he sounds like himself, and that's what blows you away. And the strength of his identity carries everything, and that's really what has to drive it.
This is true. And speaking of that and touching on that, Shalash is your new album, and what inspired you and what caught your ear when you created and were creating Shalash?
Really, our identity gelled. Honestly, it was the 2 days that we were in the studio, particularly the second day. It was April 2005, and something clicked when we went into the studio to record our second album, Masada Rock. If there are guitar players listening, they'll know what I mean, and it sounds ridiculous, but it to me, it all started with this amplifier that I hooked my guitar into that had this amazing, classic, like dirty rock blues sound. And I just hit one note, and it was like, I didn't know that I had been looking for that the whole time. And it was like this flash of like, wow, and we all kind of heard it, and we blasted through that record, and we really, on that record, like found our identity as this Jewish power trio, and it's said as a tongue-in-cheek thing. So
that is the Jewish Power Trio, that moment.
Yeah. That sound, it kind of clicked in my head, kind of like what I was saying before. It's like, I don't have to be the Balkan, jazz, Jewish, gypsy, klezmer, all this stuff. It's like, the sound is just this mixture of this rock and blues sound, and also some stuff that I had gotten listening to, like punk rock, some of the more experimental music, but just this kind of rock blues sound mixed with the Jewish influence.
Now, your band name, it's very intriguing, and for those of you that don't know the name of it or the meaning behind it, Jon, can you go ahead and tell us what that meaning and significance is behind Rashanim?
It's kind of a funny story. Like, Rashanim are groggers, the things that we use to make noise during Purim, during the Jewish holiday of Purim. And, like, I asked my Jewish friends, I was like, have you ever heard this word? And a lot of them knew what it was, but they were like, no, nobody calls it that. Everybody calls it a grogger. What is that? And grogger wasn't mentioned at all. It just said Rashanim. And I actually, I was like, wow, that would make a really cool band name, the Noisemakers, like it's like such a simple, almost like overly simplistic, like what do? We plug on instruments, we make noise.
How can people find out about your band and tour dates and all that information?
You can check us out on MySpace at myspace.com/Rashanim. That's RASHANIM. My website, which has Rashanim info and tour dates and new releases and stuff like that, is jonmadof.com, JONMADOF.com, and it's one S, not two.
Thank you, Jon, for being on Now This Interview. Until next time, this has been a broadcast of Now This Interview. myspace.com, Now This Interview.